Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before you answer. When was the last time Britain felt like Britain? Not the Britain of tourist brochures, not the Britain of politicians' speeches, not the Britain someone invented to win an election. The real one. The one you actually lived in. The one where you knew your neighbors' names. Not because you had to, but because that's just how things were. The one where the street had a rhythm to it. Where mornings had a sound. Where Thursdays had a purpose. If you were alive in the 1970s, you already know the answer. You felt it, even if you never put words to it. It wasn't perfect. Not by a long stretch. There was the inflation, the power cuts, the rubbish piling up on the streets, the headlines that made you wonder what on earth was happening to the country. But underneath all of that, underneath the chaos and the strikes and the 3-day week, there was something alive in Britain that no longer exists in quite the same way. Something that economists can't measure and politicians can't manufacture. Something that once it's gone, you don't realize what it was until you're sitting in a quiet house years later, wondering why the world feels so different now. This video is about that thing. And it isn't nostalgia. It isn't about pretending the past was easier or simpler than it was. It's about being honest. The kind of honest that most people aren't willing to be. About what was genuinely there in the 1970s that has since been quietly, systematically dismantled. Not by accident, not by progress, but by a long series of choices made by markets, governments, and a culture that confused convenience with community. Because here's what nobody tells you. The Britain that existed in the 70s wasn't just a different era. It was a different kind of society. One built around people rather than platforms. Around places rather than profiles. Around the idea that you belong somewhere. Not just to an algorithm. Not just to a delivery app. But to a street, a town, a pub. A way of life that was genuinely shared. Pay attention to this. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's the story of how we got to where we are now. And it starts on your doorstep. Literally. Picture a Tuesday morning in, say, 1973. Somewhere in Britain. Could be Sheffield. Could be Bristol. Could be a town in the Midlands you've never heard of. It doesn't matter which one. Because what happened on that Tuesday morning happened in almost every town in the country. And it happened the same way. The milk float came first. That quiet electric hum before 6 o'clock. The soft clink of glass on stone. The milkman knew your name. He knew you took 2 pints on a Monday and 3 on a Friday. He noticed if the bottles hadn't been taken in. He asked after your mother. By 1975, around 94% of milk sold in Britain was delivered to the doorstep in glass bottles. Not because it was fashionable, because that was the infrastructure of daily life. A man on a float, knowing every household on his route, functioning without anyone deciding he should, as a quiet thread in the fabric of the neighborhood. The baker came next. The butcher on the high street knew your cut. The newsagent had your paper ready without being asked. The post office was a place you went to and sometimes stayed in longer than you intended, because you ran into someone. None of this was designed. There was no community strategy behind it, no government initiative, no app connecting local residents. It just existed, because local life was still structured around proximity, around repetition, around the slow accumulation of small recognitions that together add up to something enormous, the feeling of being known. And being known is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the most fundamental human needs there is. Not famous, not popular, known, by the people in your immediate world, by the woman at the counter, by the man who delivers your milk, by the neighbors whose windows light up at the same time each evening. That's what the 70s Britain had, and what it's been hemorrhaging ever since. The supermarkets didn't just replace the butcher and the baker, they replaced the interaction. The anonymous trolley replaced the conversation at the counter. The self-checkout replaced the person behind the till who'd been there for 20 years and remembered your face. Convenience won, community lost, and nobody voted for that trade. Nobody was asked. It just happened, slowly, across decades, until one day you realized that you could live in a street for 3 years without ever learning the first name of the person next door. But that's just the beginning of this story. Because what was happening on the street was also happening in the living room, on the television, every single Thursday night. And that's where the real power of the 70s becomes impossible to ignore. Thursday night, 7:30, 1976. Across Britain, millions of people sat down at roughly the same time, in front of the same program, Top of the Pops, BBC One. Not by obligation, not because there was nothing else on, though frankly there wasn't much, but because it had become something far more significant than a music show. It had become a ritual, a shared moment, a weekly appointment that an entire nation kept together. During its heyday in the 1970s, Top of the Pops attracted regular audiences of up to 15 million viewers every week. In September 1979, it peaked at 19 million. 19 million people watching the same program at the same moment. Not on catch-up, not on a streaming service 6 months later. Together, right now, all of them. Think about what that means, not just as a television statistic, but as a social fact. If 19 million people are watching the same thing at the same time, then on Friday morning when they go to work or school or the shops, they have something to talk about. They have a shared reference point. They share a moment. And that shared moment, that common cultural ground, is not a trivial thing. It is the invisible architecture of a society that still recognizes itself. That's what British television was in the 1970s. Not just entertainment, architecture. The BBC and ITV between them gave the country a shared experience week after week. These weren't just popular programs. They were the connective tissue of a nation. They gave people who had nothing else in common, a common language. And here's the part that nobody talks about. When that shared television experience fragmented, when satellite television arrived in the 1980s, when streaming splintered into 1,000 individual bubbles, Britain didn't just lose its favorite shows. It lost the shared conversation those shows had been generating for decades. It lost the thing that allowed a steel worker in Sheffield and a teacher in Surrey to sit down together and laugh at the same moment. Today, nobody watches the same thing at the same time. Not really. Not in that way. The most watched programs now pull in 4 or 5 million viewers on a good night. A fraction of what a Thursday in 1976 looked like. And the people watching them are not talking about them the next morning in the way that people once did. Because the next person you speak to is probably halfway through something entirely different, on an entirely different platform, in an entirely different universe. This isn't progress in the way we usually use that word. This is fragmentation. And fragmentation, it turns out, has a cost that never appeared on anyone's balance sheet. But here's what the television story doesn't tell you. The real rupture wasn't happening in the living room. It was happening underground. There is a number that most people today have never heard, and that most politicians would rather you didn't think about too carefully. In 1970, the production sector, manufacturing, mining, metals, the physical industries that built things and dug things and made things, employed 8.6 million people in Britain. 8.6 million. By 2016, according to figures from the Office for National Statistics, that number had collapsed to 3 million. More than 5.5 million jobs gone. Not relocated. Not transformed. Gone. And those weren't just jobs in the economic sense. They were identities. They were communities. They were the reason certain streets existed, the reason certain pubs were full on a Friday evening, the reason a town in South Wales or County Durham had a centre of gravity at all. In 1971, the steel industry alone employed 323,000 people in Britain. By 2014, that figure had fallen to 34,500. A workforce reduced to 1/10 of its former size in 4 decades. The miners understood this. even if nobody around them had quite the words for it yet. In January 1972, the National Union of Mine Workers called the first official strike since the 1920s. Britain's power stations began running low, cities went dark. The government declared a state of emergency. And then, from the 1st of January 1974, Edward Heath's Conservative government imposed the 3-day week. Commercial users of electricity were limited to 3 consecutive days per week. Shops and offices lit by candle. Factories operating at partial capacity. Families sitting in the dark, listening to battery-powered radios. It was, objectively, a crisis. Nobody pretends otherwise. But look at what the miners were fighting for. They weren't just fighting for a pay rise. They were fighting for the right of their communities to survive. They were fighting to remain relevant in a country that was quietly making decisions, at the highest levels, about which industries would be allowed to continue and which would be left to die. Trade union membership in 1979 stood at around 50% of the British workforce. Half the working population represented collectively, with a voice that governments, whatever you think of how that voice was used, were genuinely forced to listen to. By 2021, that figure had fallen to 23%, and in the private sector, lower still. The point is not that unions were always right. The point is that when they disappeared, when the collective was broken apart into millions of isolated individuals, something fundamental changed about the balance of power in this country. Now, before we go any further, there's something I want to say directly to you. If you're watching this channel and you grew up in Britain, whether it was in a terraced house in Manchester, a council estate in Glasgow, a village in Suffolk, or a suburb of Cardiff, then you didn't just read this history, you lived it. You were there. And that means you know, in a way that no textbook can quite capture, what has been lost. That's exactly why this channel exists. To remember it properly, to name it honestly, not with rose-tinted glasses, but with clear eyes and real respect for what that era actually was, the good and the difficult together. If that matters to you, subscribe right now. Hit the bell so you don't miss a single video. And leave a comment below telling us what you remember most about the Britain you grew up in. Whether it's the sound of the milk float in the morning, a particular street, a television moment, or simply the feeling of a neighborhood that knew your name. We read every single one. And share this video with a friend who would appreciate it, because these stories deserve to be heard by the people who actually lived them. Like the video if it's speaking to you. It helps more people find us. Now, let's keep going. Because the story of the 1970s isn't just about economics. It isn't just about industry and unions and power cuts. It's about something else entirely. Something that happened every day, in every neighborhood, in a way that was so ordinary nobody ever thought to celebrate it until it was already gone. It's about the children. In 1971, a study on children's independent mobility in England found that 86% of primary school children were allowed to walk home from school alone. 86%. Children walking through their neighborhoods unaccompanied, learning the map of their own world, building the kind of confidence that only comes from genuine independence. By 1990, that figure had fallen to 35%. By 2010, it was 25%. And more recently, researchers have found that the area within which children are permitted to roam unsupervised outside has shrunk by 90% since the 1970s. The 70s child left the house after breakfast and came back for tea. They knew every shortcut, every dog in the street, every older kid to avoid, and every adult you could knock on the door of in an emergency. The neighborhood was their classroom, their social world, their training ground for everything that life would later require of them. That was not irresponsible parenting. That was community. That was the implicit understanding that children were safe because a neighborhood was a living thing, full of people who knew each other, who kept an eye out, who considered themselves collectively responsible in a way that didn't need to be stated because it was simply assumed. That assumption is now gone. and in its place is a child who spends, by some estimates, more time on a screen each day than they spend in school. That is not a moral judgment, it is a fact, and it is one of the most significant changes in British childhood since the war. Now we come to the pub. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is where it gets sentimental, where someone waxes lyrical about warm beer and dartboards and the smell of cigarette smoke. That's not what this is. This is about function. About what the pub actually did. Not as a place to drink, but as a piece of social infrastructure so fundamental to British life that academics from multiple universities have spent years studying exactly what happens to communities when it disappears. Research published in regional studies by academics at Northumbria University found a statistically significant positive relationship between the number of pubs in a community and measurable level of community cohesion. In plain English, more pubs, stronger communities. Fewer pubs, weaker ones. The pub wasn't incidental to British social life. It was load-bearing. So what happened to it? According to figures from the Campaign for Real Ale, when that organization was founded in the early 1970s, Britain had approximately 75,000 pubs. 75,000. By 2000, the British Beer and Pub Association recorded 60,800. By 2025, that number had fallen to 44,650. More than 30,000 pubs lost since the height of the 1970s. 30,000 centres of community life, shuttered. In many cases replaced by nothing. Not another gathering place, not a community hall. Nothing. Each one of those closures was a blow to something specific and irreplaceable. Not the alcohol, not the carpets or the fruit machines, but the regulars who sat in the same seats every week. The conversations that crossed class lines because the room didn't permit you to ignore each other. The local knowledge passed between people who had lived in the same area for decades. The quiet companionship of people who didn't need to explain themselves to each other because they had been explaining themselves to each other, slowly, for years. That is what a pub was. A place where you belonged without having to perform belonging. Where you didn't need to update a profile or optimize a network. Where you were simply there, and that was enough. In the 1970s, that kind of belonging was not extraordinary. It was Tuesday. It was Thursday. It was Saturday lunchtime. It was woven into the week so completely that nobody thought to call it anything other than normal life. Today, Britain appointed, and this is real, this actually happened, a Minister for Loneliness in 2018. The government of one of the world's leading nations created a ministerial position specifically to address the fact that millions of its citizens had no one to talk to. The Centre for Social Justice found that 2023 to 2024 was the loneliest year on record in Britain. Nearly 6 in 10 adults reported feeling lonely most or some of the time. That equates to 32 million people. 32 million. And yet somehow, when the pubs were closing at a rate of nearly 2,000 a year, nobody called it a public health crisis. Nobody appointed a minister for that. There's still something crucial to understand here, something that explains why all of this happened, and why it wasn't an accident. Here is the part of this story that is genuinely uncomfortable, the part that complicates the easy narrative. Because it would be simple, very simple to point at one politician and say, there. That's where it went wrong. That's when Britain stopped being Britain. And there is a temptation, particularly in retrospect, to lay everything at Margaret Thatcher's door, the destruction of the mining communities, the weakening of the unions, the promotion of a certain kind of individualism, the famous suggestion that there is no such thing as society. But here is the truth that history requires. The erosion of British community life did not begin in 1979. It was already underway before Thatcher came to power. The forces that fragmented Britain, the supermarkets displacing the high street, the car culture undermining the pedestrian neighbourhood, the television beginning its long march from collective experience towards individual preference, These forces were in motion throughout the 1970s. What Thatcher did was accelerate, and what she accelerated was real, and its effects on specific communities, the pit villages, the steel towns, the shipbuilding regions, were devastating and lasting. The loss of 4 million jobs in manufacturing, mining and metals in the decade following 1979 did not just change the economy, it shattered the social architecture of entire regions. But the deeper truth, the one that belongs to no single party and no single decade, is this. Britain's sense of itself as a community was already fragile before the hammer fell, because the forces that were dismantling it were not primarily political. They were economic and cultural. They were the logic of the market applied to human life, the logic that says efficiency matters more than continuity, that convenience matters more than connection, that growth matters more than belonging. That logic didn't arrive in 1979. It had been accumulating for decades, and the 1970s were the last moment, genuinely the last, when the counterweight to that logic still existed. When communities were dense enough, connected enough, and organized enough to push back. Trust in British political institutions has collapsed in the decades since. In 1973, polling found that 14% of people said the British system of government needed a great deal of improvement. By the time of the most recent British social attitude surveys, 45% said they almost never trust governments of any party to put the nation's needs above their own political interests. 58% say they almost never trust politicians to tell the truth. The 1970s were not a time of blind trust. There was skepticism. There was anger. There were strikes and scandals and chaos. But the relationship between citizen and state, between neighbor and neighbor, between individual and community, had not yet broken down in the way it has since. People were still, in a meaningful sense, in it together, even when they disagreed, even when they were furious. What came next was something quieter, and in many ways harder to see. Let's talk about music. Because no story about the 1970s in Britain would be honest without it. Between 1970 and 1979, British music did something that no country's popular culture had ever quite managed before, or has managed in quite the same way since. It didn't just produce popular songs, it produced an entire vocabulary, a set of sounds and images and attitudes that the world recognized as distinctly, unmistakably British, and that the world wanted. David Bowie, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, The Clash, Rod Stewart, Black Sabbath, Slade, T-Rex, Elton John, Queen, the Sex Pistols, Kate Bush. Within a single decade, from a relatively small island, came a torrent of creativity that reshaped global popular culture. These weren't artists who happened to be British. They were artists whose Britishness was inseparable from what they were making. The grit and irony and irreverence and wit. Within a single decade, from a relatively small island, came a torrent of creativity that reshaped global popular culture. These weren't artists who happened to be British. They were artists whose Britishness was inseparable from what they were making. The grit and irony and irreverence and wit. But because Top of the Pops brought them into your living room on a Thursday evening, because Radio 1 played them in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, because the music was in the air, shared, argued about, danced to, discussed in pubs and schools and factories and on buses, when the Bay City Rollers appeared on Top of the Pops, the screaming was not just the sound of individual enthusiasm, it was the sound of a generation experiencing something together. When punk arrived in 1976 and 1977, when the Clash and the Sex Pistols tore through the comfortable assumptions of the music industry, that too was a shared experience. Something that meant something to people across the country simultaneously. The music of the 1970s was, in a sense, the sound that Britain made when it was still loud enough to be heard. When it still had enough collective energy to produce something genuinely new and genuinely dangerous and genuinely its own. What has happened since? British music has not disappeared. There are extraordinary British artists today. But the shared moment around music, when it still had enough collective energy to produce something genuinely new and genuinely dangerous and genuinely its own. What has happened since? British music has not disappeared. There are extraordinary British artists today. But the shared moment around music, nobody argues about the charts the way they argued about the charts in 1973, because there is no single chart that the whole country is paying attention to. The music fragmented when the community fragmented. They were the same process. What replaced it was tidier and considerably quiet. Nobody argues about the charts the way they argued about the charts in 1973, because there is no single chart that the whole country is paying attention to. The music fragmented when the community fragmented. They were the same process. What replaced it was tidier and considerably quiet. There is a question that this video has been building towards, and it isn't a comfortable one. If the 1970s was the last decade that Britain genuinely felt like Britain, if the community, the shared culture, the collective identity were all still meaningfully intact, the closing of the pubs was not inevitable. It was the result of tax policy, business rates, planning decisions, and a cultural shift towards home consumption that governments could have chosen to resist. They chose not to. The collapse of the high street was not inevitable. It was the result of planning laws that permitted out-of-town retail development and supermarket chains expanding into communities without restriction. Nobody had to allow it at that scale. They chose to. The collapse of the high street was not inevitable. It was the result of planning laws that permitted out-of-town retail development and supermarket chains expanding into communities without restriction. Nobody had to allow it at that scale. They chose to. The destruction of the industrial communities was not inevitable. There were choices made about which industries to support, which to abandon, and how quickly that determined which towns survived and which did not. Other countries, facing similar pressures, made different choices. The atomization of British social life, the shift from collective experience to individual consumption, from shared institutions to personal screens, was not the inevitable result of technological progress. It was the result of a culture that consistently valued efficiency and choice over continuity and connection. To queue for candles with your neighbours. To sit in a darkened pub by candlelight because the electricity had gone off again and nobody saw any reason to go home just because the lights were out. To feel, even in crisis, even in difficulty, that you were part of something larger than yourself. That feeling has not been abolished. It still exists in parts of Britain, in places that manage to hold on to some of the density and texture of local life. But it is no longer the default, and that is the most significant change in British life over the past 50 years. Not the technology, not the economy, not the politics. The default has changed. That feeling has not been abolished. It still exists in parts of Britain, in places that manage to hold on to some of the density and texture of local life. But it is no longer the default, and that is the most significant change in British life over the past 50 years. Not the technology, not the economy, not the politics. The default has changed. The assumption that you belong somewhere, to someone, to a shared way of life, that assumption is no longer built into the structure of daily existence the way it once was, and recovering it, or even honestly acknowledging that it has been lost, requires a kind of courage that is rarer now than it used to be. So here we are. The question was, when did Britain stop feeling like Britain? And the answer, the honest one, is not a single moment. It was a process. A long, slow, quiet process that began in the 1970s and accelerated through every decade since. The pubs, the high street, the manufacturing industries, the shared television experience, the children playing out until tea time, the milkman who knew your name, the neighbours you actually spoke to. None of these things vanished overnight. They eroded, piece by piece, decision by decision, year by year. That is why that decade matters. Not because it was perfect, but because underneath the turmoil the foundations were still there. The street, the pub, the factory, the television ritual, the children out until dark, the neighbours on first-name terms, the sense, not performed, not campaigned for, not hashtagged, just lived, that you were part of something. That is why that decade matters. Not because it was perfect, but because underneath the turmoil the foundations were still there. The street, the pub, the factory, the television ritual, the children out until dark, the neighbours on first-name terms, the sense, not performed, not campaigned for, not hashtagged, just lived, that you were part of something. Here is what the statistics leave out. The loneliness figures, the pub closure numbers, the data on children's shrinking freedom, all of it is real and important. But what it can't fully capture is the texture of what daily life felt like when all of those things were present. When being British wasn't an identity you had to assert. It was simply something you lived. That is what has been lost. And naming it matters. Not so that we can retreat into the past. You can't go back, and anyone who tells you that you can is selling you something. But so that we understand clearly what we have given up, and what we might, in our own small ways, choose to recover. The conversation with the person at the counter. The drink with the neighbour. The decision to know the name of the person next door. None of it will reverse 50 years of structural change, but all of it is how communities actually rebuild, not through policy, but through the patient accumulation of small human choices made day after day. The 1970s were imperfect, difficult, often infuriating, but they were alive in a way that is worth remembering, worth honoring, worth understanding, because understanding what was there helps us see more clearly what is missing now. And if you feel that absence, if this video has put words to something you already knew but hadn't quite said, then you are not alone. 32 million people in Britain are lonely. But you found your way here, to a channel that takes these memories seriously, that treats your generation's experience with the respect it deserves. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you miss. Tell us what you remember. Tell us what your street was like, what your town felt like, what Thursday nights meant to you. We want to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who would understand it. Like the video if it resonated. Because this story belongs to you, and we're not done telling it.